This week on Quadriga, Syrian future, a role for Assad. The civil war in Syria has gone into its fifth year and no end is in sight. More than 220,000 people are estimated to have been killed in the conflict, and almost half the population has been displaced. Now the U.S. has signaled it may be ready for compromise. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has said the U.S. would have to negotiate with the Assad regime and was exploring ways of relaunching talks.
To get the Assad regime to negotiate, we're going to have to make it clear to him that there is a determination by everybody to seek that political outcome and change his calculation about negotiating.
Until now, the U.S. and other Western countries had insisted Assad could play no role in the future of Syria. The Syrian opposition, as well as Turkey, Britain, and France, have rejected the U.S. about-face. Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome. It took the rapid rise of the radical jihadist group ISIS to finally focus attention on the ongoing war in Syria. And that, despite the fact that far more people have died at the hands of Assad's forces than at those of ISIS. Will the new focus result in a truly realistic and committed effort to end the fighting, even if it means sitting down with Assad? That's what we want to talk about today with three people who are following the conflict in Syria very closely. It's my pleasure to welcome Kristin Helberg. She was based in Syria from 2001 to 2009 as a freelance correspondent for various German broadcasters and print media. She continues to report regularly from the Middle East. And we're welcoming Fawaz Tello. He is part of Syria's secular opposition movement and one of the founding members of the National Council of the Damascus Declaration. He's been living in exile in Germany since 2012. And finally, a pleasure to welcome Andrew Denison back to the show. He is the director of the research consortium Transatlantic Networks. He analyzes international and domestic security policy with a particular focus on the Obama administration. Fawaz Tello, I know that you suffered at the hands of the Assad regime. They imprisoned you, I believe, from 2001 to 2006. But after 4 years of war, in the face of disintegration across the region, would you say it's time to simply do what it takes to end this fighting, even if it means negotiating with Assad?
Let me start that it's a revolution. It's not a war. It's not a civil war. It started as a revolution and it will stay as a revolution. In spite of there's some effects here or there, including the ISIS here and there. And yes, all this, most of the Syrian people think that it was a good decision to destroy this wall of fear inside them and start this revolution. And I think a revolution without goals to be finished, there is no. It's so bad. While there is not a half revolution. Till now, you are talking about 200,000 people. Actually, the real figures could be reach double of that figure. We have about quarter million detainees in Vietnam, 12 million refugees, and the regime is already having a very bad military approach for what's happening in Syria.
We're going to take a look at the situation a little bit later in the program in detail. But yes or no, negotiate with Assad or not?
No, it's like throwing oil over the fire. This is what's happening now. It's useless.
Andrew Denison, last year was the very bloodiest year in the conflict so far. We just heard some of the statistics. 76,000 Syrians died in 2014. ISIS now controls half the country. Is it time to do whatever it takes? Isn't the risk of allowing this conflict to continue even greater than the risk of sitting down with Assad?
Well, yes, and sitting down with Assad. Let me come to that in a second. First of all, your point, conflict is getting worse. Civil wars do that. They don't just automatically go out. They tend to get worse and worse and worse until something dramatic happens. All the parties are exhausted, are dead, are incapable of fighting, or in our global age, the outside world comes in and tries to put pressure on the different parties. Now, as horrible as Assad is, I do not believe that negotiations can arrive at an agreement that do not reflect the realities of power on the ground. And Assad's government controls large parts of Syria. Not all of it, but parts of it. And if you want a ceasefire, much less some sort of sustainable political order to stop the bloodshed, I think you have to talk to all the powers on the ground. Even, I mean, at some point, some people in ISIS, we're going to at least have to try to talk to them. Now, I should say in the Middle East, oftentimes you sit down to negotiate with an enemy, and one of you pulls out a pistol and blows the other guy away or blows him up. So it's not as if when you're negotiating with each other, you're necessarily going to be friends. It may be very dangerous, but I don't think we should rule out negotiating with Assad.
Kristin Helberg, I know you've taken the opposite point of view in the past. You've said Assad should not be viewed as the lesser of two evils, and he's no bulwark against terrorism. But you wrote that more than a year ago, before the bloodiest year of the conflict so far. Is there really a feasible alternative to negotiating with Assad?
No, there's a big difference. He's the origin of the problem, but this doesn't mean that we should not talk to his regime. Obviously, and this is nothing new, we have been seeing talks and negotiations between opposition and representatives of this regime in Geneva twice. There's nothing new about what John Kerry said. There's nothing new about what Foreign Minister Steinmeier said. This conflict will end at the negotiating table. The problem is, and this is the interesting point, John Kerry said, how do we get Bashar al-Assad to this table ready to compromise? Because Bashar al-Assad has no reason to compromise on anything right now. So what we need is more pressure, military pressure on the Assad regime to be able to sit there and to find a solution that means a real transition of power. And by the way, all the opposition fractions agree that the exit of Assad is not a prerequisite, and he has not to leave before negotiating. But in the end of a true negotiating process, a real transition of power must be there, and the future cannot be with Assad in Syria.
Does that help at all to bridge the gap between the positions here, Fawaz Tello, if we say that we need to distinguish between the short term and the long term? Is there perhaps a potential for a deal where Assad would stay in power just for a transitional period to end the fighting? That apparently is the path that is currently being advocated by the UN Special Envoy for Syria. He says, look, to end the fighting, to end the destruction in Aleppo, we need to talk to Assad, but only for the short-term solution, not for the long-term one.
I think what Mr. de Mistura is proposing is not...
He's the special envoy, just for our viewers.
Special envoy. Yeah, actually, he is not proposing any political solution. He is just some handling some problems or some destruction here and there. And to deal with, negotiate with Assad, I think, why the world doesn't negotiate with ISIS also. Like, look, in Syria, yes, we are ready to speak with the people of the regime. I mean the Alawis who is controlling Syria now, but not with Bashar al-Assad and some big officers who is ruling all the destruction, all these crimes. I think the first priority for the international community, not to have not to speak with Bashar al-Assad, but to get Bashar al-Assad out of the scene. Anyway, and after that, people from inside the regime, we can sit with them and negotiate for the... This will be a good approach. Otherwise, I think we are using the time, wasting the time. And I will want to distinguish here between the priority of the international community. You mentioned that before one year, the ISIS became so powerful and controlling 1 or 3 of the Syria, etc., etc. Okay. Before that, ISIS was not exist. ISIS as a result of political failure of the international community of dealing with the Syrian problem. You have to deal with the Syrian problem to get rid of ISIS. Not only to send some jet fighters to bombard them. And believe me, there is priority for the international community now is ISIS, the Syrian on the region, and the Iraqis in the country is not the same priority. The first priority is to get rid of the sectarian regime, to have a democratic, civil, secular state, which the international community can play a very good role when be a partner with this process. Yes, ISIS is a problem, and who can fight ISIS on the ground is the Sunnis in the and it means the people who is mainly having this revolution inside Syria, or those people who is suffering in Iraq. It means to build a real partnership with these groups to get rid of ISIS.
I want to come back to that in just a moment to talk about the opposition, but perhaps it does seem, Kristin Helberg, that many people within the international community are now coming around to the way of thinking that we actually do need to solve the Syrian revolution, civil war, in order to stop the rampage of ISIS across the region. Your own Foreign Minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, said this week the only way to end the violence is negotiations for a political solution, even if that makes talks with the Assad regime necessary. Would you agree?
That's okay to solve the whole political crisis in big negotiations. This will be with people from the Assad regime. I just said this. I think the major fear of people, of Syrians, the major fear is that now we misunderstand Bashar al-Assad as a partner in the fight against terrorism. This is the main point. That people think, and this has come up, some people have come up with this in Western capitals. They say, well, you know, he's the lesser of two evils, so let's fight ISIS with Bashar al-Assad. So this is a very wrong conception, and this is people who don't understand the very dynamics in Syria, because Bashar al-Assad himself, as Fawaz Tello just mentioned, he's the reason for ISIS growing up. He has always gone after the moderates. He's fighting the moderate rebels, the moderates, the activists on the ground. These are the people that Bashar al-Assad had gone after. He left the jihadis out of he freed them from his prisons. He let them grow inside the country because he needs them to present himself as the big protector of minorities and, you know, as the one who is fighting terrorism inside his country. So we should not misunderstand. He cannot be a partner. And nobody is, I think, thinking about going to Damascus and shake hands with Bashar al-Assad. Nobody thinks about this, and nobody says this. Even Steinmeier said, yes, in the end, we have to negotiate, everybody agrees, but to get to a real negotiating process, you have to change some military things on the ground. And just let me finish with one point. Bashar al-Assad does not control his areas by himself. We have a lot of pro-regime militias that have grown out of the Shabiha militias in the beginning that have a very strong say locally, and they don't necessarily listen to what the presidential palace in Damascus says. So he is not in control. He is listening to orders from Tehran. Iran is a very important player, military player inside the country, and Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah. So Bashar al-Assad cannot even be a partner because he's weak militarily.
Andrew Denison, Kristin Helberg told us we must not misunderstand what Assad can or cannot do. Sometimes it looks like there is a bit of confusion in Washington on this point. Shortly after Secretary of State Kerry made the remarks that we saw in our introductory report, an envoy here at a meeting in Berlin with Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the foreign minister, took it all back and said, no, we're not thinking of negotiating with Assad. Meanwhile, Assad says airstrikes against ISIS are being coordinated indirectly through Iraq. In other words, the U.S. apparently does see him, at least indirectly, as a partner in the fight against ISIS. Does Washington have a clear strategy here?
Well, it's easy to misunderstand Washington, just like it's easy to misunderstand Syria and what will affect Assad's calculations. I think at least the president wants to stay out of this fight. Kick the can down the road. That's the oldest rule in the political book. He's only got 2 more years left. He's been in Afghanistan and Iraq. He doesn't want to get in it. So he does as little as possible. The beheadings created a political firestorm, so he had to start launching airstrikes. But even then, he was saying, we're not going to be Iraq's army, much less take on Syria. Now, why does Kerry, at this point, say, I might talk to Assad?
But he didn't say this.
Well, or whatever his little firestorm that he created. I think it has to do with his negotiations with Iran. In that moving Iran also has to do with how we position ourselves via the Assad government. And of course, if we got help from Iran in Syria, it would be great. And if Iran wasn't as dependent on the Russians as they are now, that would be great too. Which comes back to your point. You said that talking to the Assad government isn't going to change anything. And I agree with that. Just because we say we're going to talk to them doesn't change the military reality on the ground, which is that Assad still has power to rule large swaths of territory.
With the help of Iran and
with the help of Iran and all the others, and Russia too, not by himself.
He's depending on foreign...
Right. So we would like it. But we've been at this for 4 years. And all along we've said there's no military pressure for Assad to negotiate a deal with the rebels, because we haven't been willing to put military pressure on him. And I fear that we can, ask for military pressure on Assad till the cows come home. But as long as Germany isn't willing to lead the way, I don't think America is going to do that right now. So we're
Germany
stuck.
take the lead, not the US?
Well, you've got 100 trainers from the Bundeswehr in the Kurdish part of Iraq. You should have 1,000 there. It's expensive. So if we want to change the situation on the ground, we're going to have to invest more. I don't see America interested in investing. And to be honest, I don't think Germany's interested in getting in a fight there. It's got Ukraine, it's got Greece. So here we are 4 years into this tragedy. And I fear the answers are easier than the question, how do we get the will to pay the price to fix it?
Let me now come back a bit later to the regional power politics surrounding this. But let's take a look, first of all, at the situation on the ground in Syria.
Mohammed and his brothers are getting a rare chance to just be kids. The boy's father died a year ago. He'd been fighting with rebel forces. I'm praying to Allah that I'll be the best student in 2nd grade and that my father, who's in paradise, is happy. After 4 years of war, massive destruction and human rights abuses in Syria continue. The Syrian army dropped barrel bombs filled with explosives and sharp pieces of metal on a residential area of Aleppo. These are all civilians and families. I don't know what to say. Since the early morning, they've been bombarding us, bomb after bomb. Fighter jets over a region near Damascus. This recent video shows how people live in fear. And there are still suspected chemical attacks against civilians. On Monday, an alleged chlorine gas attack killed 6 people in the province of Idlib. The Syrian military called the claim propaganda. Civilians are being killed and injured, not just by Assad's troops, but also by rebel groups and Islamic State militants.
The fighting and the suffering are displacing millions, both within Syria and beyond.
24,000 refugees have gone to Egypt. 235,000 fled to Iraq. 620,000 went to Jordan. Lebanon has taken in 1.1 million refugees. Turkey gave refuge to 1.6 million. And 21,000 people have sought asylum in Germany. In total, over 3.8 million people have fled from Syria, and there are 7.6 million displaced persons inside the country.
Fawaz Tello, let's come back to what we saw in that first report regarding the use of chlorine gas. The opposition and international NGOs say that the Assad regime is continuing to use poison gas. Does that disqualify it to be a partner at negotiations, in your view?
I think this disqualify the human rights value in the world, where when the 50% of the Syrian people displaces or refugee, when 50% of the infrastructure have been destroyed by Assad regime, everybody talking about the crimes of ISIS in the West. This is a very important point. 12 reporters were sorry that had been killed by a terrorist in Paris. All the world have been moved and touched with these people. We have hundreds of Syrian people has been killed under torture. 500 reporters, local reporters, was covering the revolution. Peaceful reporters have been killed by the regime, and there are thousands of them now in the jail under torture. Nobody take care about them. This is not. This double standard is destroying the region. What's happening now? ISIS. I said at the beginning, ISIS as a result of political fail of the international community, political fail of the Obama administration, who was persist to have agreement, not agreement, alliance with Mullah of Iran, and while he is neglecting all his traditional alliance in the area. For example, Saudi Arabia. Those people, all the region now is boiling. Even this regime, who was historically was a friends of United States, they are boiling. They are changing their attitude. And Kristin have a point for Iran. Bashar al-Assad is not controlling Syria now, and the Alawi is not controlling Syria now. Who is controlling Syria now is Iran. Everybody knows what's happening in the ground. And I think all the security people know.
As I said, I want to come back to the regional power situation, but let's briefly stay focused on that use of... Yeah.
For one point, Bill, they mentioned about the power and how Bashar al-Assad is strong, etc., etc., with the Iranian or without the Iranian. I want to mention for Daraya. This is a small town, only 1 kilometer distance away of Damascus. Those people under the siege since 2 years. And Ma'adamiya and a part of Damascus, and Assad cannot enter that area. What kind of power this regime with all this while in the same time, our problem with the United States, not to arming us or to send an air jet or to banning us. Our problem with them, and I am political, I know what I'm talking about, it's real. They are making a very big pressure over Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar for not arming the opposition. With arming the opposition, I will assure you within 1 or 2 months we can get this regime and his alliance from Syria.
Okay. Let's come back to that point. I'd like, though, to talk about the use of poison gas. The Turkish Prime Minister said this week, after this latest report about the use of poison gas, negotiating with Assad and his regime would be like negotiating with Hitler. But the fact is, Andrew Denison, negotiating with war criminals is more or less standard practice in ending many conflicts. Slobodan Milosevic, charged with war crimes against humanity, still sat down at the table in Dayton.
Exactly, Melinda. That example was also on the tip of my tongue. Europeans, your viewers will recall in the 90s bloody civil war in Yugoslavia, and Milosevic's forces were bombed. Locals on the ground were organized to fight against him, but we also talked to him.
Yeah, after bombing him, he was ready to talk. This is the whole point.
And that is
true. You see, the Assad regime does not move unless it feels unless it has some real fear in front of military action. This was the red line with the first camel attacks in the summer of 2030 in East Ghouta of Damascus. You know, they were really afraid that now Obama would send some fighting jets. He would not in the end, but this was the moment that he agreed on delivering his chemical weapons to the international community. It was the only point where he agreed on any compromise, let's say.
Theoretically, that's the only language he understands.
I agree with you that without military pressure, Assad is not going to move. Without military pressure, ISIS is not going to be defeated in Iraq or Syria. The problem is when Assad is gone, when ISIS is gone, then what?
Yes.
We don't want to go in and police that country. No. And Europeans don't either. So we are in a difficult situation.
No Syrian is asking the Americans to go in.
I know.
Really, because this would make it even worse.
The political dynamic is if we arm them, then we own it. Then there will be political pressure from around the world when the civil war continues that America go in with ground soldiers and help. Now, if the Syrians attack New York City, the calculation will change. But as long as the Syrians are just killing each other and ISIS, I'm afraid a cynical view will prevail in Washington that says, like Stalingrad, let them kill each other. We don't want to mess with that any more than politically necessary. And I would say more important at this point than arming the opposition or putting military pressure on Assad is saving the refugees.
No, and it's protecting civilians.
And protecting civilians,
Let us focus now on the opposition. Fawaz Tello, is there any group within the opposition that can present a truly credible and feasible political alternative to Bashar al-Assad? I know that you yourself resigned from the Syrian National Council because you said it was far too lacking in unity and also undemocratic.
Actually, when talking about the opposition, we have to distinguish between the political opposition, which have been talking to the international community, which after 3 years now they proved that they are big failures. I mean, this is a truth, and they have almost no connection with the people who is fighting on the ground. The real power exists in that side. And you are talking about the substitute of the Assad. This is the partnership I'm talking about. There is a reliable powers, military and civil powers on the ground, and fighting or have the effect on the ground, those people, the international community can go with a full partnership with them for a full package of the solution in Syria. And in this case, you can
So exactly which groups? Who is this? And how much of the situation on the ground do they actually control?
No, look, if the opposition is controlling now more than, we're talking about 1/3 of Syria as being controlled by ISIS. You are talking about deserts. Deserts, it's nothing.
It's 1/3.
Yeah.
Well, ISIS's problem is in Iraq, not just in Syria. Let's not forget that. The reason America is going after ISIS is not because it's a threat in Syria. It's because ISIS holds Fallujah and Mosul and the cities that Americans fought for the last 10 years. And we have a responsibility to fix Iraq, not to fix Syria. However, we might not be able to fix Iraq without fixing Syria. But then we have to be honest about what it's going to cost. Otherwise, I'm afraid, Kristen, we're just going to kick the can down the road till the next crisis or the catastrophe.
If you are talking about now about 12 million refugees, we can, and the international can help at least to protect this civilian and to replace them inside Syria when it's had no-fly zone. No-fly zone, it means...
Please do answer my question.
Yeah.
Exactly whom do you wish us to support? Who should get more training? Who should get more weapons? Who's in a position to actually govern the country?
Look, there is, if you get rid of the... I'm not talking about Al-Qaeda groups in Syria. I'm talking for very huge groups in Syria, which controlling actually more than 40% of the Syrian territory. Those people, the international community can work with them to build this administration inside Syria. They exist. On the intelligent security forces, on people who exist now in Syria and on Turkey and everywhere who is having the full studies, which maybe I am and Andrew don't know about. They know who they can talk to. It's not a matter of training. It's a bullshit. It's a joke. Training or non-killing arms. What's non-killing arms? This is a real joke.
No, I mean, training is important.
Kristin Helberg,
yes,
you
let's clear it.
You in the past have cast doubt on exactly this point. You have said the opposition does not have much control over the fighting on the ground, that they in fact do not control the factions that are currently fighting. So how do you want to put this pressure on Assad via military support for the opposition?
Let's clear this out.
I don't get it.
Let's clear this out. There's a political opposition, there's a national coalition outside the country. There are two opposition groups inside the country, still operating inside the country. There's an important point here because they have agreed on a roadmap 2 months ago in 10 points how to negotiate, in which way to negotiate with this regime and what should this lead to. This is one. This is the political opposition. Then you have the military fight inside, where you have hundreds of rebel groups, some of them moderate. They were aligned with this national coalition. They kind of distanced themselves. You have every other week, we have new alliances. The major point is there are still inside Syria a lot of moderate forces, being armed, being not armed, being civilian resistance, activists on the ground, local committees, local councils. And these are the ones who stand up for the values that the Syrians in the first place, in 2011, took to the streets for. So there are moderate forces inside Syria that we just ignore in the West. The problem in the West is not just to finish this, because there's a very we can look to the south of Syria, to the province of Dara. In the south, the situation is different. The FSA, the Free Syrian Army, or what is left of it, moderate rebel groups, work together in a better way because we have a military council inside Jordan, a US-led military operations center that is channeling all the foreign aid, foreign military and financial support to the Syrian groups. So there we have a strong moderate groups, whereas in the north, rebel groups go to Turkey, they meet the people from Doha, from Riyadh, from Washington, everybody has to look for his own financial support, and they compete in this. So how do we want them to go back and cooperate against jihadis and against the Assad regime if everybody is just trying to find his own supporters? So we have to have a strong unified military command, and we will only get this if the US comes to this conclusion that we have to build an international support channeling this to one unified military command that all the moderate rebels have to listen to.
Andrew Denison, in the past, the conclusion that many people in the U.S. have arrived at is that if we send weapons into this extremely messy, disparate situation, they will wind up in the hands of people fighting us, the term known as blowback. Is there any reason to believe that we could actually control this situation?
You know, Melinda, America is conflicted on this too. In the summer of 2012, as Obama was running for re-election, all of his advisors, Clinton, Dempsey, Petraeus, Panetta, Gates, they all said, arm the opposition. And he said no. Now that took backbone, and maybe it was wrong. But today as well, there are people, including Mr. Obama in the White House, who don't want to be involved with it. So the question is, why do they do anything at all? And I think that there is an argument for keeping options open. You want to know who's on the ground and who's fighting against whom, but very reluctant to give the kind of weapons that are necessary. So I fear that it's either going to be a qualitative change in the nature of the war, like with the chemical weapons attacks, that changes the political mood in Washington, or it's going to have to wait until another president, and we're just going to keep watching. Now, what could change? The chemical weapons, you know, we didn't go to war, Kirsten, but we did have enough pressure to pull the chemical weapons out. And I think that was actually a success. In the future, there may be a situation also where Assad is all of a sudden very vulnerable and there's an opportunity to take advantage of. But in the current situation, I fear the first target is ISIS in Iraq. And if we can fix Iraq, then we look at Syria. And maybe a question for both of you is also whether the Syria of today, with its borders, is the Syria we should negotiate for. Or are we going to see a breakup of Syria like we saw a breakup of Yugoslavia?
If I may add something to this question, to the radical groups where the weapons are ending up. This is actually the major concerns I feel in Washington, because what happened is that some of these moderate forces that have been armed by the US have been just eaten by the Nusra Front. The Nusra Front is the affiliate of Al-Qaeda inside Syria. So if you in Washington want to make sure that moderate rebels do not work with Nusra Front because they need their military equipment and they need their military strength, then just make sure that they don't need Nusra Front.
The fact is, though, ISIS is fighting now with many U.S. weapons, which it has captured as it won territory. Let's say ISIS actually is pushed back to some degree out of Iraq. The logical place for it to go will be Syria. You actually questioned the statistic I had said earlier, Fawaz Tello, that ISIS now controls about half of Syrian territory. You say it's more like a third. Couldn't it well wind up controlling more? And what will that mean for the conflict in your country if, in fact, ISIS begins to retreat into Syria?
Look, ISIS is not people who came from Mars. ISIS is people who came from the local community. And ISIS is a result of this this failure of Obama administration. Before 2 years, there was no ISIS in Syria. And for 2 years before that, all the world was watching. Yes, if you want to fight ISIS, it's the Sunni or in the area the only people who can fight. In Iraq now, Iraq now there is a big problem. The sectarian militia, who is called Al-Hashd al-Shabi now, they are fighting with the Iraqi sectarian Shia government, which is totally controlled by the Iranian, with the full agreement with the American. And now. There is about 2,000-3,000 fighters from Iran. It's coming. They are fighting directly with them in this area where the ISIS is became bigger and bigger. Look, what's happening now? That ISIS is being extended. I don't care about this political statement that we are making a changement. No, there is a big fail for Obama strategy in Iraq, and Obama non-announced strategy in Syria. When you want to get rid of ISIS, have a partnership with the people who can get rid of ISIS. First of all, the Sunni in the region. By the way, Al-Nusra they are not, yes, maybe there is 1,000 or 2,000 persons came from outside, but the most of them, they are real fighters who changed their loyalty, like Kristin said, to have support, to have Israel, because they have main priority to get rid of this regime. This is our priority. This is not, I know that the West have another priority, but you have, as in the West, to accept our priorities. We want to fight regime, Assad regime, and al-Nusra in the same time, Al-Qaeda in the same time, but we are not going to fight Al-Qaeda with the Assad or without the Assad. We will wait what is happening, and we can fight after all what will lead. And you can't end, before that, by the way, all the Europeans, they should know the refugee problem just in the beginning. After 1 or 2 years, you have to accept 1 million refugees. Because you are doing nothing. If you, I know this is the main problem for the European, the refugee. And United States, they think that they are far away. They will not be affected. Look.
Let me ask Kristin Helberg, because you have told us several times we need more military pressure. We need for the U.S. to really make that happen. You've heard very clearly from Andrew Denison about the ambivalence. It's not going to happen in that way. What about the role of the UN? The UN Security Council just a month ago passed a resolution, finally, saying that the use of chemical weapons would be prohibited and that they would take military action against the parties if they were to use them. Could that be pressure on Assad? Could that make a difference?
Well, it only makes a difference if there's anybody ready to go for it and to really implement these very few resolutions. The Security Council is paralyzed about Syria. So the very few resolutions that we have seen last year, there were 2 of them banning barrel bombs and asking for humanitarian access to the population inside Syria. Both of them are not being implemented. The reports of the international NGO says this very clearly. The situation has just grown even worse than before. The barrel bombs are used every day. They are raining down. You can watch them live falling into Syria. Bashar al-Assad sitting there saying that, you know, we are not using barrels, we're just using bombs, you know. It's ridiculous, you know. So now again, we have a resolution which is very difficult because of the powers inside the Security Council. Russia and China obviously trying to hold their protecting hands over the Assad regime. So we have this resolution. If nothing happens now, we have seen chlorine gas. It's clear that it has been used in Idlib again. 6 people, 1 family wiped out. If you watch the videos, it's just horrific. Amnesty International having passed a report. It's everything, it's documented, everything is clear, everything is well known. The UN institutions themselves are saying chlorine gas is continuously being used because it's not forbidden as a chemical weapon, because it can be used for other purposes. So it's all happening and nobody is ready to take up in the end this responsibility.
Andrew Denison, that blockade in the Security Council, of course, very much about the tensions between the US and Russia, Russia as the protector of the Assad regime. Russia now says it's going to sponsor a new round of talks. It's not afraid to talk to the Assad regime. It does so frequently. It's going to bring together the Assad regime and members of the opposition. Would you expect anything to come out of that initiative?
Well, Russia plays a very troublesome role in the Middle East from my perspective. I think also from Berlin's perspective here. The government doesn't think it's good that Russia vetoes or refuses to support UN Security Council resolutions that have come over the last 4 years to economically isolate the Assad regime, to put more military pressure on it, though with the seal of approval of the United Nations. The same with Iran, a friend of Assad's regime, protected in the United Nations by the Russians, the old problem, you know, of the Niet. And so you work around the United Nations. And at the end of the day, as tragic as it is, and it is the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century, as bad as it is, it could be a lot worse. It could be a lot worse. If the Assad government disappeared and no American soldiers or German soldiers went in, it might really be a war against all, and those chemical weapons will come to play. And in Iraq, too, Iraq could fall apart. What if Iran doesn't agree next week on nuclear weapons? Then we've got a whole nother fight. So I fear our first priority has to be keep things from getting worse, and they could get a lot worse. And then
But
slowly
let's see, we have just a very brief
But
time
working
left.
on who will represent Assad, this is the important point. What will come after him? This is the whole point. So we have to focus on this.
We have a very brief moment left until the end of the program, and I would like to ask you, Fawaz Tello, about a regional solution. You've mentioned a lot of different regional actors. U.S. officials have said, look, we need a political solution to this. We need a solution where Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all the actors involved in this region are at the table. Could it happen, or is it purely utopian?
At last, this is what's going to happen, because now what's happening is...
When will it happen, and what could make it happen?
When they have the desire from the United States, and I think we have to wait after till after Obama finish his period now. I think they're Republican, and I hope they will win, by the way. And they can make a big difference in this matter. Look, for the Iranian, all the Syrian people, in the revolution, supporting the revolution, looking for the as enemies. We are not talking to the people who they are occupying our country just right now. They are occupying our places, our cities. We will not talk to them. We are looking for the Russian as not mediators. They are somehow as partner with Bashar al-Assad, or supporting him politically, and then now the Syrian people looking for the American administration as working for undercover. They are putting the Russian in the front, and but actually they are working together. I want to mention something. Since 3 years, with every diplomats or politician from the West I have met, they will saying, go and talk to the Russian. They are in the same boat.
Kristin Helberg, very briefly, regional solution possible, and who could make it happen?
Well, everybody's meddling inside Syria. Whoever meddles inside has to be part of the solution, has to sit at the table. But still, the situation is not, the Russians are not trying to get a real solution. They are trying to keep Bashar al-Assad and to make it look like some opposition figures sitting here and there and talking to them. Nobody will agree to this. Some real opposition figures, they will not go there and talk about the future of Assad. They will talk about power transition and, in the end, a future without Bashar al-Assad. So the Russians have to accept, if they want to keep a say inside Syria, they should accept that the figure Bashar al-Assad and the security apparatus has to be dissolved, and let's look for other partners.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Thanks to you out there for tuning in.